And now, marine weather around Alaska. Hi, I'm National Weather Service meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska marine weather outlook as we go into Friday and Saturday. Starting out with the sea ice, though, on this Thursday afternoon, we find the ice extent here in Bristol Bay and Kuskokwim Bay has lessened. The edge of the ice is not as sharp or as far south and west as it was about a week ago when we were in the midst of just the deep freeze across much of the mainland into the eastern Bering and even up here through Cook Inlet. Cook Inlet's had quite a bit of ice, the most ice in several years. But again, we are going to see a push of warmer air coming up from the south that's going to cause some of this ice to shrink back here as we go through the weekend, because temperatures are going to be getting up into areas of south central up toward Anchorage above freezing here over the weekend compared to the deep freeze we were in a week ago. Looking at the low pressure area late tonight, early Friday morning, we have a fairly deep low down around 964 millibars that'll be crossing the Alaska Peninsula, coming onshore around Cape Newingham and then up into the lower Yukon Delta Friday night into early Saturday. This front will continue advancing northward and northeastward, and it will have some stronger gusty winds along it, as well as some moderate to locally heavy precipitation. Some of the heaviest snow that'll fall with this front will be in the northern Panhandle, as much as 4 to 12 inches of snow Friday into early Saturday morning. Areas of the mountains of the eastern Kenai on up into western Prince William Sound will pick up 1-2 feet of snow. Turnagain Arm, winter weather advisory for up to a foot of snow later this Thursday evening through Friday evening. And then gusty winds will spread inland up along the Alaska Range with this system. So by Friday afternoon, the lows crossing the Alaska Peninsula, heading up toward Cape Newingham, and then we have the front advancing eastward into the Panhandle. And for Saturday, that low works its way up through the lower Yukon, and we expect the front to kind of wash out here, just a lingering trough along the Gulf Coast. And then a couple of other lows, not as deep, but they'll be taking a similar track to the north. So this is just going to allow a continuation of milder air to overspread up through the Gulf Coast region and up into south central and eventually up into the interior. We're not going to see anything nearly as cold. That was probably it for the winter as far as our deepest cold that we had. And now temperatures will be relatively milder and some drier conditions as we go into the mid-month. So looking at winds Friday, inner channels, southeast winds to 25 knots there, Ketchikan, Metlakatla around Dixon Entrance, waves 6-7 feet. In through Stevens Passage, north winds 20 knots, gusts to 35 knots, 4-foot waves, and then northerly winds within Lynn Canal. Those winds 15 knots with waves 3 feet. For the outer nearshore waters along the outer coast of the Gulf, we expect southeast to east winds anywhere from 30 to 45 knots, strongest there off of Cape Suckling. Waves 13 to 15 feet, but in just in excess of 20 feet there off of Cape Suckling. For Saturday, winds do come around. They become southerly, 15 to 20 knots inner channels with waves running 3-4 feet in Lynn Canal into Stevens Passage, but as high as 10 feet there, Dixon Entrance. And then for the outer coast, generally southwest to west winds around 15 to 20 knots with waves 16 to 18 feet. And along the northwestern Gulf, a bit of a barrier jet as the front comes in. So off of Hinchinbrook Entrance, we could see easterly storm force winds to 15 knots with waves 15 to near 20 feet. For along the Kenai coast, easterly winds to 40 knots. And then there at the entrance of Cook Inlet, northeasterly storm force winds to 15 to 50 knots with 15-foot waves. Winds northerly in upper Cook Inlet at 30 knots, and then easterly 40-knot gales within the broader expanse of Prince William Sound with waves as high as 10 feet. And for Saturday, winds do come down. Notice the wind shift, though, mainly southeast or southerly winds 25 to 30 knots across the region as milder air is going to be brought northward up in past the Gulf Coast into the southern central interior. And we expect winds southeast 30 knots, Prince William Sound 7-foot waves, southerly winds to 30 knots, middle lower Cook Inlet and off the Kenai coast waves 8, 9 feet there in Lower Cook Inlet, and as high as 12 to 18 feet swells there off of the Seward coastline. And then in the vicinity of Kodiak Island, Friday, look for southeast to south winds, 35-knot gales. Waves could be approaching 20 feet off of Kodiak Island. Those winds with the low pressure area that'll be lifting northward, we expect them to turn easterly within Bristol Bay to 30 knots, but then on the backside, wind shift around to the southwest to west, 25 to 30 knots, waves 12 feet off of Sandpoint Falls Pass, and 5 to 9 feet there north of Cold Bay. For Saturday, then we continue generally a broad southwesterly flow across Kodiak Island and the Alaska Peninsula, right around 30 knots, with waves running anywhere from 8 to 14 feet on the North Pacific side and maybe 8 to 10 feet on the Bering side. Looking at the Aleutians, eastern Aleutians, look for west to northwest winds, 30 knots. As we get west, winds are out of the further west, westerly winds across the central Aleutians to 25 knots, and then 15 to 20 knot winds in the western Aleutians. And for Saturday, southwest to west, southwest winds 25 to 30 knots here over the eastern portion of the Aleutians. Westerly 20 to 25 knots, and then northwest winds 15 to 20 knots, especially there west of Adak. And looking along the southwest coast, we have offshore flow 25 knots out of Bristol Bay, 20 knots out of Kuskokwim Bay, north winds to 25 knots St. Matthew to St. Paul. And then generally northeasterly winds around 25 knots out of Norton Sound and along the lower Yukon Delta, with ice in place there. And then for Saturday, that low lifts up into this region. So ahead of it, southeast winds in the eastern central portion of Norton Sound, turning north-northwest on the backside of the low, and then westerly there in the Pribilofs, St. Paul, 20-knot winds, 6-foot waves. And then we have either west or southwest southerly winds into Bristol Bay and into Kuskokwim Bay as high as 25 to 30 knots. Along the Bering Strait, north of it, well, I should say south of it, northerly winds to 25 knots there off on the west side of Seward Peninsula and St. Lawrence Island. Northeast winds around 25 knots all the way from off of Wainwright down through the lower Chukchi Sea. And then generally easterly winds around 25 knots along the Arctic coast from Utqiagvik over to Kaktovik. And for Saturday, winds will generally continue northeasterly. Westerly, though, that outlier there in Kaktovik, but northeast winds 20 to 25 knots, as high as 30 knots off of Wainwright, Point Lay, and say Point Hope. And then dropping down through the Bering Strait, northerly winds to 30 knots along the west side of the Seward Peninsula, Wales, and up toward the north end of St. Lawrence Island in the vicinity of Savunga and Gambell.